Welcome to Rolmo, Interviews with Positive Energy. I'm Yeshi Wangmo, and today my guest is Amba, Rinchen, Sarah Caldwell, who is Skyping with me from her home in Pacifica, California. Amba Rinchen received her PhD in Cultural Anthropology from the University of California, Berkeley in 1995, specializing in South Asian arts and religion. As an undergraduate, she studied at Yale University, philosophy, literature, and opera singing. Amba Rinchen has over 16 years experience teachings in universities such as UC Berkeley, University of Michigan Ann Arbor, California State University, and Harvard Divinity School. She has authored 2 books on the divine feminine. The first book is called Kali, Slayer of Illusion, and the second is called O Terrifying Mother, Sexuality, Violence, and Worship of the Goddess. She has also published numerous academic articles. In addition, she has directed a documentary film based on her original research on Kali rituals in southern India. Amba was initiated into Siddha Yoga by Swami Muktananda in 1978, and she lived in his ashram in India for 5 years. After his passing, she continued with Swami Nityananda and received many important initiations from other masters as well. She has also served as a priest at a temple in San Jose, California, and she is now retired from that temple and living with her husband in Pacifica, California. Earlier this year, Amba connected with me and the Tibetan Vajrayana tradition through a Dakini Heart Essence program I had in Berkeley, California. And since then, she has received empowerments, transmissions, and instructions from Lama Tarchen Rinpoche, Lama Sultram Alioni, and myself. I've invited Rinchen to the Rolmo series to churn the depths of her knowledge and experience of the divine enlightened feminine, and to explore a comparative view of Dakinis and Yoginis in the Hindu and Buddhist tantras. Welcome, Amba.
Thank you so much, Lama Yeshi. I'm delighted to be here with you. Thank you.
You're welcome. We have so many wonderful topics in store for our viewers today. We've been preparing for this interview that we've decided to have 2 interviews, and this is the first one. In this first part, we're going to focus on an overview of the feminine divine in Hindu and Buddhist tantras. And in the second interview, we're going to start creating a comparative Hindu-Buddhist Dakiniology, taking a look at Lalita Devi in the Sri Vidya tradition and comparing that with Yeshitsogyal, Kurukule, Singamukha, and Troma. So let's begin. Rinchen, I'd love to begin with having a little glimpse into your personal story, your education, your spiritual roots, and how you came to be so deeply connected with the subject of the divine feminine.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to share that. I wanted to respond to the wonderful metaphor you gave in your introduction of churning, because churning in the Hindu goddess tradition is how the goddess is created out of an ocean of chaotic activity that's going on, actually a war in the primal oceans. The goddess is churned and emerges like butter out of milk as goddess Mahalakshmi, the goddess with all the prosperity, the wisdom, the Vedas, the great scriptures, everything comes out of that churning. And churning also is a kind of a great metaphor for me as I try to understand the chaos of my own life. And I think that the goddess, whom I'm always trying to come closer to, maybe she emerges out of this churning. And another image in the churning story in Hinduism is 2 sides pulling, 2 snakes that go around this pole in the center like a butter churner in traditional cultures. And I'm seeing you and me, you know, as on these 2 complementary sides churning the snake around from the Dakini and Yogini sides, the Hindu and Buddhist sides, but they're all interwoven, you know. And out of that, I hope that we create something beautiful and jewel-like in our conversation. So I thank you for that.
That was already so enlightening. Rinchen, thank you. I love that connection.
Your comment, you know, the churning was great. So
So
anyway,
since your childhood, has your life been churning?
Yes, right. So let me try to condense, this 40-year, very long story into a few salient points that are worth talking about. Another image that I think is important as I look over those years of my life, it's nice to be this age because you start to try to see some patterns, is there's always been, again, this dual churning between the academic approach and the personal experience approach. I've always been interested in spirituality and in truth, but I have approached it from two very different ways, back and forth, back and forth. So as a child, I grew up in New York City with a single mother who was an advertising executive, and I come from a half Jewish, half Christian background, but I wasn't raised with either of these as spiritual traditions. It was basically a secular upbringing. And I would say that the spirituality of my life was the arts. My mother took great pains to take me to all of the artistic riches in Manhattan. So I attended all of these operas, museums, and so on. And our family valued writing, drama, ritual, all kind of artistic endeavors as the highest thing. So as a youngster, at about 15 years old, I went to the Tanglewood program for young artists in the Berkshires in Western Massachusetts, and was studying opera singing at that time. And I had a very powerful, I'd say my first spiritual experiences were at that place, which is also created by the first conductor of the Boston Symphony, Serge Koussevitzky, as a spiritual retreat in a way. So he wanted to bring young people together with great masters. So Leonard Bernstein, Seiji Ozawa, all these great masters were there, and we got to meet them one-on-one. So it was a beautiful retreat experience. I was 15. And the first day I got there, I heard this beautiful story by Seiji Ozawa, who was the conductor of the Boston Symphony, which talked about his own spiritual experiences in Japan with a Zen master, Zen Buddhist master, and how he experienced these compositions of Western music by going deep into his heart, and they would have kind of come forward as holistic expressions of some deep energy. And that sort of started me right from there. And that summer, I also had some very powerful experiences, one would say way out there, kind of mystical experiences while listening to classical music. I was listening to a Sibelius symphony that was being played at Tanglewood one afternoon, and all of a sudden started feeling I was hearing voices and seeing visions. Probably I was having a little psychotic episode, I don't know, but it was quite powerful for me, and I felt that there was a message coming through to me from the universe, and that I was having a deeply spiritual altered experience, altered state of consciousness. So I went on to go to school at Yale University and studied philosophy of art, aesthetics, because I was so taken by these experiences that no one had ever explained to me, and I felt there was something in the music itself or in the experience of the arts that was causing these altered states of consciousness. So I was trying to understand that, but all of the lectures I was hearing and the academic atmosphere at that time really didn't provide any answers to me. And the Western philosophy of aesthetics also was not giving me any insight into these experiences. Finally, I took a course on Dante, the Divine Comedy of Dante Alighieri, partially in Italian and partially in English. And when I read that book all the way through to the final, most people only read the Inferno, but if you read it all the way through to the Paradiso, the paradise, where he tries to go beyond language, through poetry, tries to show you the direct view, the direct experience of the divine consciousness and love. It's all about the love aspect through transcending linear language. It's incredible. So after reading that, I went to my professor and I said, I can see all these smart alecky intellectual things about this, but there's only one thing that this book brings to my heart, that I have to know the answer. I said, I feel Dante is grabbing me by the throat and pulling me forward into his face and saying, see this, find this. So I said, you've been studying this your whole life. I only have one question, and that is there a God? Is this true? And he said to me, this is a question we cannot ask in the university. And that answer basically I said, well, then I don't want to be in the university, because I need to know that. I need to know none of these smart things. I need to know, is this true or not? And I found this in Plato, Kant, anybody I was reading, this passion to see directly. So I did. I left school. I said, okay, I have an artistic temperament. I must be an artist. I'm not an intellectual.
I think so. I think already your story, you know, starting off with the connection to music and the arts. I mean, this is the embodiment of Saraswati, right? And Saraswati is one of the goddesses that the Hindu and Buddhist traditions share. And I think that's pretty obvious.
Well, something was pulling and pushing me, that's for sure. So I went and tried to be an opera singer, but I was impatient with that because I didn't want to do all the scales and all of the work. I just wanted these core experiences. I ended up in a meditation class. I was actually kind of having a lot of mental problems at that time. I was very depressed and I was very unsteady. And I had a boyfriend who said to me, well, you need meditation. So I just picked something out of a book. Literally, I had a catalog from the New School in Greenwich Village, and there were several meditation classes. I just picked one that sounded good. And the first day I went, again, it was sound. You know, they taught us this mantra, Om Namah Shivaya, which is the mantra of Lord Shiva in the Hindu tradition. And we sang it, we chanted it, and there was some talks and things. But it was that chant. When I heard that mantra and started singing it, burst into tears, the tears rolling down my face. I had recognized what I was looking for. All I could say was I was home. I was where I wanted to be. Well, naturally, being a rather passionate temperament, I then left everything I was doing and went and lived in an ashram and followed my guru for 5 years. I wanted to be a nun. I became a celibate. I learned all this Hindu chanting and lived a very monastic life for 5 years until I was 23.
And who was your guru at that time?
Swami Muktananda, the Siddhi Yoga that you mentioned.
Okay.
So I traveled with him and lived in India and so on. It was wonderful. I loved it. I never wanted to stop. But he left his body in 1982. He passed away. And before he passed away, he started to just hint at and introduce this goddess tradition, which he really didn't teach us about, but I could see was very important toward the end of his life. And so this laid a little egg, you know, in my heart about the goddess, which I really didn't know about. Anyhow, I then went back to school because I didn't know what else to do. I was 24 and I didn't have a degree and I couldn't earn a living and I had to go back to reality. So I went to UC Berkeley. I got my degree in cultural anthropology. I studied about goddess rituals and naturally brought this same question to bear about intense spiritual experience that is provoked by drama. So what I studied was a kind of a ritual. There are many in India, many ways in which the arts express or provoke spiritual experience. But I wanted one that also had to do with gender and psychology and other things that interested me. So I studied in South India, in Kerala, the state of Kerala, a ritual in which men dress as the goddess Kali, who we're going to see more of later, and becomes possessed by her spirit. She enters them and they become her. And I was very interested not only in their inner experience, what it meant that a man was experiencing the divine feminine. Also, women were not allowed to do this. That was interesting to me. Why shouldn't women do it? Which we do see a lot in cultures all around the world, that goddesses are often born by men and women are not supposed to get involved. They can watch, but they can't be the goddesses. So that started to interest me. And also the role of the arts themselves, the actual drumming, the ritual, and so on. So I studied that. I did a film, and I have a lot of, works that I've produced about that. I taught for a few years, as you mentioned, and in 2001, when I was at Harvard, I went to a temple in Boston and met a priest there who was from a family in South India that worships the goddess. And saw a picture of his father-in-law in his house, and that was it. Again, one of these, zip, you're in something else now. I just had to go to him. I took permission from my guru, Mahamandaleshwara Swami Nityananda, who told me to go. And I went to South India and took this Diksha, or a formal initiation in the Shivacharya lineage, which is a very ancient lineage of priests to the god Shiva. All this time I was very devoted to Shiva.
Can I just ask you here, are you saying that in some Hindu traditions there is goddess worship and in others it's not so prominent?
Yes. I would say that most of the Hindu traditions, the formal traditions, are male deity oriented, and the goddesses exist as an aspect of them. There's only one part of formal Hinduism, temple Hinduism, where the goddess is the main deity, but it's kind of a little bit of a sideline in many temples. Now people are more interested.
Okay.
However, at the kind of gut level, of villages and in real life, people do approach goddesses more. Just as you might go to your mom before you'd bother with your dad, because mom is easier to talk to. So yes, finding a goddess tradition is not the first thing you'll normally see, especially in those times.
Great. Sorry, thanks for answering that question.
Thanks for asking. So anyway, I took that initiation. It was very powerful, and it was rather unusual for a woman, especially a Westerner, to take this initiation, which is required by these priests to be able to do the worship of Lord Shiva in these agamic temples. Agamic refers to Tantra in South India, the way it's understood. The word Tantra in South India doesn't always have a very positive connotation. It's often understood to mean black magic or things that are not very good. So they use the word agama, which is a kind of scripture, but it's basically the same idea. And we can talk later about what that means. Anyway, I took that diksha, that initiation, and my whole life changed. I almost immediately and very unexpectedly left academia completely. I spent the next 10 years, so from 2001 till 2011 or 12, just learning all these priestly rituals and going very deep into sadhanas or spiritual practices related to the goddess. So I took a lot of other initiations. I studied Sri Vidya, which we'll be talking about, which is a goddess tradition, and Kali and Chandi and different goddess traditions, learning their mantras, their rituals, and so forth. At the end of that period, the son of my guru, the eldest son, Swami Sadashivam, requested me to serve as the priest, which is also extremely unusual. I was told by one woman, Hindu woman, there are no women priests. You can't be a priest. So that is the usual attitude. There are not normally women priests. But he's a very forward-thinking person, and he requested me to serve as the priest of a Shiva temple that he was bringing to the West. And so I did that for 3 years. And it was an all-Indian congregation, almost no Westerners. So it was very interesting.
Not Western people, not Americans.
Well, not Westerners.
You're really embedded in the Indian community.
Very interesting to see how they would respond, because of course I'm not born as a priest. I'm not born a man. I'm not an Indian by birth. But it worked well, and many people liked it a lot, and I did my best. And then this year, another sudden shift, precipitated largely by encounters with illness, which I think is worth sharing, because many people who come to spirituality come because they're suffering. And I was certainly one like that. And throughout this 10 years, my husband, who I met in South India and who helped me with my research, has undergone 2 heart transplants, a kidney transplant, lung tumor removal, and another very serious disease. So I was helping him through this time, and it was kind of encountering death constantly in this worship of this, particularly the fierce goddesses, Kali, Chandi, and so on. In the last operation he had, which was last November, and he's fine, he came through it beautifully, we came to meet a person from Lama Tarchin Rinpoche's lineage, who was the chaplain at the hospital. And my husband requested a Buddhist chaplain because he felt that it was more soothing than a Hindu priest. So that person deeply impressed me, deeply impressed me with his compassion, his ability to help and speak directly out of his heart, no books, no texts. We thought my husband was dying, and he came and he just spoke to him in such a beautiful way. And he kept coming, and he kept helping me. And he knew that I was doing Hindu practice and I was working in a Hindu temple, but that didn't bother him at all. He was totally accepting. He never tried to push me in any way toward anything. He just gave a lot, and it was very powerful. And I found after I left that experience in March, when I was at home with my husband, that I was very drawn to these teachings. I came to know that you were coming to town. And on the recommendation of my friend, the chaplain, I took my very first empowerment with you. And it was really powerful. So we're going to talk later, but some of the deities that you introduced me to were very familiar to me from my Hindu practice. And it didn't feel like any kind of a real shift. It was just kind of a phase shift, It was just like a different way of doing
another channel.
another channel. So that brings me to right now.
Wow.
So there's been this kind of back and forth between these different ways of approaching the same tradition.
Thank you very much for sharing so much of yourself and your story. And one of the things that I really noticed in the story is that you are a person who has had big transformative experiences through receiving mantras and initiations. And I find, that is a little exceptional. Nowadays, I think people receive initiations, but nothing much really happens. But in your case, what really stands out for me is that your connections, when you first received the mantra and other initiations, there it was really impacted, like big upside down, creating that chaos that leads you to the next step and the next thread, and your whole life weaving these, I would say, couple of threads, one coming really from your deepest inner life, and then meeting the external world, and then having these transformative experiences. I think it's been a very exceptional life, Amba.
So kind of you to reflect it, because we feel inside that if our life isn't perfect from some societal view, that we're a failure.
Yeah.
So it's I'll say one thing, which is that this has taken a lot of strength.
Yes.
And some people who have seen my life going along, even people who've been partially involved, have been frightened by seeing the effects of mantra on my life. And I've responded to them that there's nothing to be afraid of. Perhaps this is why I'm attracted to fierce deities, because I feel that, if we love that enough, if we want that transformation deeply enough, which is what I've always wanted, that's like our lover. We want it. Anything we have to do to get it, we'll do it. And there shouldn't be any holding back or any fear of what's going to happen, because we're only moving toward truth.
Great.
So that's it.
Yeah, bravery and courage, to follow what's happening and not ignore it. That's a great lesson for everybody, I think. I would like to talk forever about these experiences, but I'd like to move on to, I myself do not have much knowledge of the divine feminine, enlightened feminine goddesses, yoginis in the Hindu tantric traditions. I've already learned in this interview that it's not a prominent theme in all Hindu tantric traditions, or Hindu traditions. I guess maybe could clarify maybe before we begin. There are Hindu, like in Buddhism, we have sutra traditions and tantra traditions, and two general classifications. So do you have something similar in Hindu also? And is the feminine found in the tantric tradition, or how does that work in Hindu tradition?
Yes, I think there's a similar dichotomy.
Mm-hmm.
Most of what people today refer to as Hinduism, which is really a scholarly label that is put on a gigantic collection of things from a huge geographic area throughout thousands of years, and there isn't really a Hinduism. But we have to use a category, so there it is. It basically refers to everything that people were doing in the subcontinent of South Asia, which is really a lot. But people today who call themselves Hindus will generally refer to the Vedas as the core of their religion. The Vedas being the orthodox scriptures, just like the Bible for Christians, the Quran for Muslims, and the Sutra tradition for Mahayana. So they're core revealed scriptures that are supposed to actually be divine words that can never be changed. They're not compositions by humans, and they're memorized, and they're used as mantras as well. So Hindu priests memorize usually one of the 4 huge compilations of the Vedas perfectly, without any recourse to text. And that's what it is to be a Hindu priest. I have not done that, but that's what a traditional priest does. There then is the agamic revelation, which is historically later than the Veda. and which is probably the same time period as the Buddhist Tantras and later. So that is to say from the 4th century BC and later. And then Tantra, as I mentioned, in the Hindu context, is a very problematic word, as it does not appear to be in Buddhism. Like Buddhism, it seems to refer to the source of deepest power. But unlike Buddhism, it's been associated with magic and things that are not considered to be very good, and sex and things that are not part of the purity rules of Vedic Brahmanical Hinduism. Brahmanical refers to the Brahman caste, which are the people within Hindu culture who have the right and the duty to memorize the Vedas and to be priests. So the goddess only really appears, she appears a bit in the Vedas, and we'll see in our slides, but she mostly appears strongly in the tantric and Puranic traditions, which are outside the mainstream.
Well, you know, in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, the Tantras have also diversified too, and we do talk onto the side of magic and ritual, and we also have that in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. So maybe that's just something that comes with the territory, neither good nor bad, but it does happen. So with that clarification that the feminine principle appears more prominently in the Tantra tradition of Hindu texts, let's say. Let's start I want to thank you so much for preparing these slides that I'm going to be showing our viewers as you talk about them. These slides that present an overview of the feminine divine, right?
Right.
Okay, so give me a moment here, and while I'm getting my slides, if you'd like to tell us a little bit, just an overview of what we can expect with the slides, and then I'll bring up the first slide.
Sure, pleasure to do that. So this is going to be a really whirlwind tour due to our time and space constraints. A longer version of this PowerPoint, I'm going to make available on another website, which you can contact me to get that information. I just thought, one of the best things to do is to see the beauty and plethora of images in the goddess traditions of Hinduism. And I'm going to lay out a few of the themes. It's a huge topic, but many of you are interested. And the wonderful thing about this recording is that you could go back to this recording on YouTube and you could stop at a slide and look at it in more detail.
Okay.
So don't feel overwhelmed, but we're just going to whiz through here, and I'm going to give you an overview of these traditions. Okay. So we're starting with a slide that shows us the goddess Durga in a stone carving from the 8th century. And talking about the worship of the goddess in Hinduism. And I'll just start with a little prayer to her that comes from the Devi Mahatmyam, which is the first Puranic, very important text to the goddess in Hinduism, probably composed around the 7th century of the Common Era, that is AD, for those who use that terminology. So it's pretty late compared to Buddhism. Buddhism's already been around many centuries. And the tantric traditions in Hinduism also were around earlier. But this was the first entry of this tradition into the mainstream of Hinduism that priests and people who spoke the Vedas were also using. So she became a major deity through this text. It's a 700-verse text. We chant it every year.
This is Durga?
The goddess is called Durga.
Durga, okay. I don't think that's on the slide. Okay.
No, it'll be on the next slide. Sorry,
okay.
It's not at all clear. But it says here on the slide, Chandipat or Devi Mahatmya. So that is the text.
Okay.
And this song is taken from a song of praise in chapter 5 of this 13 chapters text. And in this song, she's praised to different ways that the goddess dwells within all beings in different forms. So I'll just sing that.
Thank you.
Ya Devi Sarva Bhuteshu Buddhirupena Samstita Namastasye 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 Namo Namaha. To that goddess who dwells within all beings in the form of intellect, I bow again and again and again. And in this text, we then go on to enumerate her in the form of everything, including stupidity and beauty and everything. So it's a wonderful vision of her as multiple, as pervading everything. But I chose the intellect one so that we can stick with this long enough to understand it.
Okay, thank you.
So we'll just kind of go through the next slides.
Okay.
Basically, I'm just going to show you some images of the Divine Feminine and some of their attributes, and then summarize those for you. So we'll move into the first image, which says Durga on the top. And I just mentioned her. She's the same one that was in that first slide. And you see her here beheading the buffalo demon. This is part of the story that's told in the Devi Mahatmyam. It's a very famous story in Hinduism. Goes through various episodes of killing demons who represent our own negative qualities. So here I see a similarity actually to Buddhism in that their anger, desire, and ignorance are these three major problems that we have,
right.
And that all evil actually comes from within ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So this image of the buffalo demon, although he's described as a character and there's a war and there's cutting and killing, it's very interesting because this killing is taking place in the final chapter of her destruction in the war. He's been hiding in all different guises. And the idea is that our ego keeps on popping up in new ways. We get rid of our most gross, obvious forms of badness, but they come back in spiritual pride, or they come back in thinking we're very enlightened or something like that. So this demon represents that quality of the ego to transform into new and ever more subtle guises. But Durga Devi is not at all fooled, and she just cuts the head right off and chops it off, and his true form, because he's been hiding as a buffalo, comes out as this, you see the little green demon guy here, and his ugly form comes forward, and then boom, before he can do anything else, she gets him right in the heart. So the idea is that what appears to be fierceness in her approach is the compassion of piercing through our ignorance and our ego all in one stroke. So this is the quality of Durga. She's the destroyer of evil, and there are much gentler approaches, but this happens to be her form. The next slide shows you Sita, a very different kind of deity. She's actually considered to be a semi-historical or a legendary figure who was the wife of the god Rama, who in turn is incarnation of Lord Vishnu, a god of Hinduism. And she's a heroine who is the ideal wife. Durga is not a wife. She's not ideal wife. Sita is an ideal wife. So she's chaste, loyal, beautiful, and long-suffering. She goes through a lot of horrible things and never ever veers from her complete chastity and loyalty to her husband. She is a role model for many Indian women and much revered. Then we go next to Radha, another image. Radha, although not married, is the beloved of Krishna. She represents a different way of the erotic sentiment, the longing of the soul for union with the divine. And there's a lot of room in Hindu mythology and in Hindu spirituality for all the different emotions. So you saw we started with anger and, righteousness. Then we go to loyalty and piety. In Radha, we see what's called Sringara, or the erotic essence, the feeling of the erotic. And this is one of the beauties of the Hindu path, is it allows you to work within your own emotions and kind of map them onto these stories and use them as a path. So there are people who spend their whole life just chanting to Radha and Krishna and feeling this erotic play and love that they have, because she's actually married to someone else. And Krishna
so it's like what Joseph Campbell would talk about, using mythology to understand yourself.
Exactly. So the Hindu tradition provides a great deal of this. So Radha is the soul's longing for union. Then we move to Kali, who's familiar to many people. The most fierce and perhaps frightening to see of some of the images. She is a female deity who has severed heads around and a cup of blood and some features that your Tibetan viewers are very familiar with. And she represents the power of time, of death, of destruction, and of yogic transformation. So her primary meaning is total transformation. So we'll move through that. Then we see, again, another lovely one, Lakshmi, Mahalakshmi, who is very popular and represents prosperity, abundance, love, wealth, and goodness. And she's very popular, many temples to her. Then Saraswati, whom you mentioned before, Lama Yeshe, who is the goddess of the arts, music, and learning. And here you see three images from three different views. The center one is from the Jain religion, which is actually not considered to be a goddess religion, but there she is. She's shown with a musical instrument, with a book in her hands, and she is the goddess of learning. Then we move to Devi or Mahadevi, who is the great goddess. Devi simply means goddess, and she is the queen of the universe and the bestower of bliss. And these images actually refer to Lalita Devi, whom we will be talking about more in our second interview in the Sri Vidya tradition. But I showed them just as an example of the form of Hinduism in which the goddess represents the completion of all attributes. So here she represents that principle which creates the universe and is the predominant deity. The male deity isn't even present in this image. If you go to the next one, you'll see that there are three main types, and you can study the details of this later. But amongst these types of deities, we have three things, and they're interesting. The benevolent or Saumya forms emphasize marriage and the auspiciousness or good fortune that comes from marriage. So the marital state is considered the right state for women in Hindu culture. Women should be married, and they should be happy in their marriage. They should be enjoying their life sexually. They should have enough to eat. They should be cared for. They should have children. And therefore, they represent the power of happiness and prosperity and life moving forward. So it's a very positive view of the female, but only in relation to a husband. So it's in that relationship that she comes to her fullest florescence in traditional Hinduism. Secondly, we have mother forms who are protective, and these include the frightening deities, Kali, Durga, Shitala, and Mariamman, who are mentioned, are disease goddesses. They are the goddesses that bring smallpox and fevers, and they are considered mothers. So you have to call them mother, and you have to get their protection, and they're nice to you. To your enemies, they will protect and hurt. Finally, the earth forms, the Ganga River. People may know that the river Ganges and all of the rivers of India, many stones and hills are considered sacred. Okay, so in the next few slides, you see some just images because it's for Western women to see these variety of images that don't shy away from the female body. Not only is she represented as a stone in two of the pictures you see in the next slide, where she's shown with her red color and so on. She's very fierce there. But these earlier ones on the top, and in the next slide as well, show the fullness of her body and the importance of that as power. So there's not an effort to make her skinny or make her demure. She's fully in her body, and that is her power. In the slide following that, you see some very elaborate images. One is a temple processional image of the goddess Parvati, and then a painting, a tantric painting of Varahi Devi from the 17th century. Wow. And Varahi is another deity who is shared that we're going to return to in our second interview. But there she is with her boar head, and you can certainly see the relationships there to the Tibetan Tantra. The next slide shows you another important aspect, which is that the goddesses are often multiple in Hinduism. There's a huge amount to say, which I won't say, but this shows you some of the ways in which the goddess appears as enumerated, either as the phases of the moon, as 8 of the same, or 7 of aspects of the same, and that has another very important meaning. So goddesses are cooperative, they're not hierarchical, and they appear as multiples in a circle or a shape that can support one another. Now let's move on to the main points. So what's most important to perhaps remember is the next slide, which is that goddesses represent Shakti, or the divine power. The meaning of goddess in Hindu tradition is somewhat different from perhaps the divine feminine in Buddhism, and we'll explore that later. So Shakti is the divine power of nature, of creation, the life force itself, all movement, the mind, all thought process, language, strength, and destruction. So even martial force, like the ability to harm and hurt and protect, is all feminine, is Shakti. So these are two lovely images of that. In philosophy, the next slide just summarizes some views of Shakti in the early philosophies of South Asia, including Buddhism and Jainism in its early period. In basically all of these different philosophies, and we're talking about 2,500 years ago when these philosophies were being created and talked about and debated, all of them viewed the female as negative. The female represented nature and matter in a negative sense, as that which contributed to samsara, attachment, desire, wanting to keep coming back, and illusion, the idea of maya or illusion, that somehow the feminine was seducing us into wanting to be here, and we shouldn't be. We should be getting away from all this. So that was an obstacle to liberation or enlightenment in the early traditions of all of these religions, who had meditations on the repulsiveness of the rotting human female, and sort of like the Eve issue in Christianity. So we'll have to move on, but that's there.
Well, we have Buddhist traditions that have that also.
They sure do. So that, the Tantras kind of shifted the whole thing, but in these early traditions, this feminine was negative. In the next slide, there's just a summary of the ways that the goddess is associated with intellect, mind, and speech, which is a unique feature of the Asian traditions. In the Western traditions, we generally have heard of the feminine or the goddess as this kind of earthy, non-verbal thing. We don't have traditions of goddess as speech or as language or as intellect, the pulsation of creation. One very interesting one here is the fourth one, called Matrika Shakti, which is a tantric statement in the non-dual Shaiva tradition, which means the power of the mothers. The mothers are the letters of the Sanskrit alphabet. So each and every letter is a goddess and is a power of Lord Shiva, who creates all language, all thought, all phenomena. So it's a whole philosophy based on that. The next slide talks about Kundalini, which you've probably heard about, the power of transformation. We don't have time to go into, we'll do another time, but basically the idea that she dwells in the human body as an actual presence in the lower part of the spine, coiled up, that is awakened through tantric practice, and that rises up to bring us to liberation, piercing through the chakras or the energy centers in the body. So all of that yogic practice, which is also in other tantric traditions, is a feminine power that causes that to happen. Then the next important philosophical point is that Sri Vidya, or the supreme wisdom tradition, worships the goddess as all phenomena in a very elaborate way, and considers her to be all that there is to be known. So it's an elaborate tradition of puja, of mantra, of hand gestures, of meditations, that cause the worshiper, male or female, to identify directly with the goddess, bit by bit, in a very elaborate way, reversing the entire process of creation within one's own body. So there's the idea of understanding creation as an emanation of the goddess in a very specific way through different steps, and reversing that ritually in your own body and going back to the state of emptiness, we could say, using Buddhist terminology, and there are similar terms. So this is a very elaborate tradition that I studied a lot. It's very interesting. Just briefly, people always ask about the relationship between goddesses and women. So our female spiritual role models in Hinduism are many. People think that women in Hinduism seem to be oppressed because they always have to be married and all these things. There are many different role models in the spiritual realm of Hinduism. We have these various goddesses. The fierce ones can be role models for political leaders like Indira Gandhi, who was Prime Minister of India in the 1980s, which is way ahead of us. These heroines, these wife people who do very heroic things to defend their husbands. There are saints who are unconventional and who do not get married and who reject the regular world to become devoted to their male gods. There are renunciants who become nuns. There are gurus, and finally Yoginis, which we'll be talking about later. If we look at some images in the next slide, you can see some famous people. Amachi, Sri Ma, these are living gurus today, and then the one up in the upper left is a woman saint from the 12th century who was very beautiful and prayed to Lord Shiva to make her extremely ugly so that men would leave her alone. So she was a young woman, and she wandered naked, and she became a hag, and she has no hair, and she has drooping breasts, and she was considered very ugly because she got this prayer answered, so she could involve herself in the love of Shiva without men bothering her all the time. And then on the right, you see a yogini with a female disciple. The interesting point to me about these is that all of them have to reject beauty and sexuality. They have to be celibate, they have to be renunciants, or in some way of the role of being attractive in order to be spiritual. So we just have to think about that a little bit. Another point is that women, as I mentioned, are not allowed to be priests. And now there is some slight effort to make women priests. And by excluding women from the priesthood, they're excluded from direct access to the texts, direct access to spiritual power, the ability to help and minister to people outside their family, because women can serve even more than just their own husband and children, and to have access to the true esoteric knowledge. So it's important that women use their brain and their spiritual power to be priestesses. And the last slide is kind of an intro maybe to our later part of our interview. It says tantric yogini images. There is a period in the 10th and 11th century in India where we see these very unusual and interesting temples of yoginis and images of females who were both goddesses and human, who were sitting in teaching postures, and who clearly were adepts, who are not wives, who are not all of these other things. They are actual women, and there's actual textual evidence that people are starting to study about that. So we are very interested in this going forward.
Wow, thank you, Rinchen. I'd like to ask you one question before we close this segment. And that is, in your personal evaluation, how large or how big or how small is the gap between the principles that are expressed about the feminine in the Tantras, many of these principles that you've presented to us today? How much of a gap is there between those principles and the reality in the culture and in daily life? At times during the presentation, I felt that the principles were very much a guide to daily life for an ordinary person. Not necessarily, I don't know what the view is about reaching enlightenment and how that relates to daily life, but I was impressed about the kind of serving as archetypes for living life, whether, spiritually and well. But then when you start to mention that women aren't allowed to be priestesses, then it brings up for me that is there a gap between theory and practice?
I think
you're
that's
saying
going to be
there
a great.
is, but I'm saying, how big is that?
I think that's a perfect intro to our next segment, because that takes us right into that. So can we answer that and make them
Absolutely.
come back?
We'll start with that in the next segment. So just let our viewers know that we're just, this is part one of this very special interview with Amba, Rinchen, Sarah Caldwell. And please look on the menu on your screen to click on part two. Thank you very much, Rinchen. We'll be back soon.